Hello, my name is Nick Wareham, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Fenland Study webinar, when we're going to provide you with an update about the Fenland COVID study. This study was set up in the summer of 2020 to recruit people in Cambridgeshire in order to estimate the proportion of people in the population who had COVID-19 antibodies, indicating that they had previously had COVID-19 infection. Our second objective was to investigate whether it was possible to use novel digital methods to detect COVID early in the pre-symptomatic phase. And finally, we wished to measure the effect of pandemic restrictions on health-related behaviours. The format for this evening's webinar will have 3 talks mirroring these 3 main objectives. I will present some of the methods that have allowed us to collect information remotely from participants. Nikola will discuss the app sub-study that used digital biomarkers to detect COVID early, an example of how remote engagement and data collection could have implications for individuals. Finally, Kirsten will talk about an example of how remote methods have allowed collection of data that has allowed us to perform an evaluation of how a population has changed, using data from the COVID study to investigate the impact of pandemic restrictions on health-related behaviours. We will then move on to a question and answer session, which will be led by Jane Bramwell, who is chair of the Fenland participant panel. This is a grouping of participants in the study who provide key inputs to all aspects of it, from defining the key questions, the methods that are used, and the way in which results are reported. Jane will moderate a Q&A session in which we will attempt to address as many of your questions as possible. There is a Q&A function on your webinar screens, and you can submit questions at any point in the session tonight. We set up this project within the existing and ongoing Fenland study because of the usefulness of having pre-pandemic information, as Kirsten will describe. The Fenland 1 study had recruited 12,500 participants, of whom nearly 8,000 had returned for a phase 2 visit by March 2020, when we had to stop clinic visits because of COVID. In total, 4,023 people agreed to participate in the Fenland COVID study. All of those people provided blood samples for antibody measurement at 3 monthly intervals, and then frequent measures of diet and physical activity, a set of questions specific to COVID, and measurements of self-reported weight. In addition to linking all these data to all the existing study data in the Fenland study, we also had the opportunity to link the information to other information held by Public Health England about antigen tests that were undertaken to diagnose whether someone had developed COVID. Through necessity, all of this information was collected remotely, which was particularly challenging for the questionnaires, but even more so for the blood sample. It wasn't possible at the time to set up clinics in the early phase of COVID to take blood samples in the traditional way. Although other studies use finger prick methods for obtaining blood, these methods can be rather painful and unreliable, and may be particularly difficult, therefore, when repeat measurement is required. We employed a new technology to take blood remotely on dried blood spot paper, which was then able to be posted back to our laboratory. In order to make this work, our team had to rapidly answer many questions. For example, how easy was it for participants to use the device in their own homes? Answer, very simple. Is the device acceptable for participants to use in terms of discomfort and pain? The answer to that was it was very acceptable, and much more so than a finger prick test and even than a venipuncture. How stable is the blood sample when posted, and can it be used to interface with our antibody assay in the same way as for a venous blood sample? And it certainly, in other work that we did, we demonstrated that we got the same results using the posted one drawer sample compared to a venous sample. So I am pleased to report that engagement with all these methods over the time period was very high, as shown here by the light blue bars, and that almost all of the samples that were returned to us, the dark blue bars, were able to be used to measure COVID-19 antibodies by our lab team, shown here in red. These antibody measurements were being undertaken in a time period in which the frequency of diagnosed COVID infection in the local population was changing. This figure shows the number of diagnosed cases of COVID in Cambridgeshire between the spring of 2020 until the spring of 2021. We will all be well aware of the major peaks of infection in the autumn of 2020 and the Christmas and New Year period that followed that. But by comparison, the number of cases in the spring of 2020 looks relatively low. However, the big difference, of course, between those two periods is in the amount of testing for COVID that was going on. One critical question that follows is how much COVID infection was not diagnosed in the early part of the pandemic. Results from the Fenland study suggest that across the whole time period, 12% of people developed antibodies to COVID. Many of them developed them for the first time towards the end of the study period, which was related to the surge in cases in the winter of 2020. But there was also an approximately equal number of people who had antibodies already when they joined the study, suggesting that they had been infected with COVID in the spring of 2020, an indication that the number of diagnosed cases was a major underestimation of the true number of cases. We were also able to link data to the antigen data from Public Health England. The pattern of this was rather different, as during the time period of the study, most people who developed COVID did so in the winter waves of 2020 into the first part of 2021. Together with other cohort studies across the country, we're currently investigating characteristics that predispose people to infection. As you can see from this map of the number of cases in the Fenland study, there is marked variation with certain areas having higher case numbers. We will be investigating differences between people in susceptibility in further work. Uniquely, however, we were able to investigate in a sub-study that we undertook with colleagues from HUMA, whether it was possible, using all the data that was collected by participants, to identify early biomarkers of COVID that could enable early detection during the pre-symptomatic phase. I'll now hand over to Nikola, who is going to describe the results of this part of our study.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good evening to everyone. So my name is Nikola, and as Nick already mentioned, I'm part of the HUMA team. I work as a clinical data scientist, and my focus right now is to analyze the data that was collected in the Fenland App Study, which was the sub-study of what Nick mentioned. I'm really glad to be talking to the real volunteers today, so really exciting for me. So as Nick mentioned, HUMA in collaboration with Cambridge helped to release this smartphone application, which we then used to collect data in the Fenland App Study. This ran over 9 months from August 2020 to May 2021, and it was a great success. Over 2,000 participants signed up and took part and collected a huge amount of data. So by first of all agreeing to share with us their vital signs all collected through the smartphone application. So this was heart rate, body temperature, oxygen saturation symptoms, but also regularly filling up questionnaires. So this was everything from sort of demographic factors, lifestyle factors, and health status, mental health, pre-existing conditions, and so on. And the result of the data collection is a really unique data set that we can now use to answer really important questions, both about COVID-19 infections, but also beyond. And the purpose of my presentation today is to show you one of the projects that we're working on, and that is the early prediction of COVID-19 infection using these smartphone collected vital signs. So here I would like to outline what we're trying to do actually. So after an infection with COVID, the amount of virus in the body sort of steadily rises up until the point when the person starts experiencing some symptoms. But we know from other scientific literature that even before that, the body starts showing the signs of infection, things like increased heart rate, sleep disturbance, increased body temperature, and so on. And while the patient might not be aware of it, we think we might be able to use machine learning or artificial intelligence models to actually detect these early changes in the body after infection. So it can then help us obviously to alert the individuals early that there is something going on in their body before they can infect other people and so on. Here's an example of one participant, one volunteer, who shared all of this data with us around the time that they had COVID infection. So here in the middle, you see the day of the positive PCR test when they were confirmed to have the infection. You can see that they started reporting symptoms in the smartphone application one day before the positive PCR test. And here on the top of the screen, you see the values of the vital signs. They are displayed as heat maps, and that means that the deeper or darker the color, the higher the value of the vital sign. So if we look at the example of heart rate, you see that in the 3 weeks sort of before the infection, heart rate has quite low values, and around the time of positive test, there's an increase in heart rate, and it sort of stays up for quite a while. Similar situation with body temperature, where again, around the time of positive test, we see an increase, and then it actually peaks around the time when the participants started reporting fever in the symptoms in the application. With oxygen saturation, it's the other way around. So we see sort of this healthy baseline, that's high levels of oxygen in the blood before the person becomes infected. And then around the time of infection, there is a sharp decrease. And then again, the levels stay low for quite a while. Now, obviously, this is just an example of a single participant, but we actually had 77 people who tested positive in the 9-month period. So that's around 3.5%. And on the following slides, I would like to show you the sort of average data, or how the data look for all the participants, all the 77 participants. So first, let's have a look at the symptoms. And here on this graph, again, notice the day of the positive test. And I would like you to pay attention to two things. One is the size of the circles, which corresponds to the number of participants who reported each particular symptom in the application. And then the color, which indicates how severe the participants felt the symptoms were. So you can see in the week before the infection, some people already started reporting things like cough, headache, and muscle ache. And then as the infection progressed, these symptoms became sort of more common and more severe, and were accompanied by other things such as fever and sore throat, feeling tired. Interestingly, the symptoms that people felt were the most severe were loss of taste or smell and loss of appetite. Luckily, most of these symptoms sort of started disappearing over the couple of weeks after the positive test. But there were some participants that kept having symptoms even a month after the infection. And there was in particular cough and fatigue, feeling breathless, and the loss of taste or smell. Now on the following slide, we see the vital signs. Here we are going 2 months before the positive test. You see that all of the vital signs have a sort of healthy baseline again, that's maintained on average between the participants. And then around 1 week before the infection, we see again a rise in heart rate and body temperature. And a bit later, we see a drop in oxygen saturation. Now, oxygen saturation actually recovers quite quickly within a couple of weeks, back to the baseline level, but things like heart rate, they actually take almost 3 months to come back to the levels before infection, so quite a long-term impact. On the bottom bar here, I also have daily steps, so the levels of physical activity. These are from participants who agreed to share with us the daily steps, sort of steps from their Google Fit or Apple Health Kit on their smartphone. And you see again, there is a drop around the time of the positive test. But we must be really careful looking at the daily steps, because this doesn't just show the sort of physiological status or health of the participant, but also the government regulation could have an impact, because obviously at that time people were told to self-isolate if they had a positive contact or had a confirmed infection. So this drop in activity could also indicate that people were sort of closed at home and stayed at home. So we are really hoping that the algorithm that we are developing will be able to recognize this healthy baseline of the vital signs, and then as the person starts experiencing infection, it'll be able to detect the departure from this baseline, the change in the vital signs. And you might be asking, how is this going to be helpful now that the pandemic is getting under control? But we believe that this algorithm that we're developing, it's not going to be specific for just COVID-19. It will be able to detect other infections and things like inflammation, quite likely. So, for example, in people with some autoimmune diseases, it will be able to detect flare-ups. There are also other sort of life events which the algorithm might detect, which cause change in vital signs, things like vaccination, longer periods of stress, if you're working shifts or traveling long distance. So all of this could sort of trigger the algorithm to show a change. On the next few slides, I will just quickly show you an example of the vaccinations, how vaccinations affect vital signs, so you can see for yourself. In the cohort, we had 70% people who got vaccinated in those 9 months, and including 12% of people who had both doses of the vaccine. Here is the summary of the symptoms or side effects, you could say, that people experience after vaccination. So here at the beginning, we have the day of vaccination, and you see that quite a number of people reported having headache, muscle ache, joint ache, and fever. But all of them sort of disappeared within a few days, which in contrast with the real infection, you can really see how longer term those symptoms were when you really became infected with COVID-19. Now, if we move on to the vital signs, you see really the same signature of change. You see an increase in heart rate and body temperature, and a decrease in oxygen saturation. However, I have to say that the sort of scale of these changes is much smaller than the one that we saw in the real infection. And I just added here the black lines, which is the average for the infected people. So you can see that if you're infected, your heart rate rises much more and your temperature rises much more. The change also takes much longer time to sort of return to the baseline. Same with oxygen saturation. So just to summarize, using the data that you so meticulously collected in the smartphone application, we are able to now train an algorithm that is able to detect abnormal periods of physiology. And that will be able to alert people, hopefully early, that they're experiencing infection or other sort of stress, and will be able to help them deal with it early and more effectively. So with this, I will end my presentation and will hand over to Kirsten.
Hello, my name is Kirsten Rennie, and I'm one of the investigators of the Fenland COVID-19 study. And I'm very pleased to present some of the results we have on health behaviour changes during the pandemic, also on behalf of my colleague Vicky. So when we set up the study, we had no idea of the impact of the pandemic on behaviours such as diet, activity, sleep. We all have our preconceptions, of what the impact was from our own experiences. But as time has gone on, studies have been reporting results on changes in behaviour, with quite mixed results, some indicating positive impact and others negative. And some of this depends on the measurements they have used. And many were based on asking people how they thought their behaviours had changed since before the pandemic. And the strength of the Fenland cohort is that we actually made those measurements before the pandemic. Both at phase 1 and phase 2, participants completed measurements of diet, activity and sleep, and we used these very same measurements again during the COVID-19 sub-study at 3 time points. And this has allowed us to look at how things have changed during the pandemic. So if we start with fruit and vegetable consumption and take as a marker the reported fruit and veg intake at phase 1, you can see that at phase 2, there was a slight increase in fruit and vegetable intake, and that this decreased in the COVID study much more substantially at 3 months and 6 months compared to that phase 1 intake measurement. However, those measurements at 3 months and 6 months also coincided with periods of moderate and severe government restrictions during as well the late autumn, into winter and early spring, the time of what we know as the hunger gap, when the variety of fruits and vegetables substantially decrease over that period. So we expect a seasonality in fruit and vegetable consumption intake as a result of that reduction in variety. We also expect behaviours to be influenced by age. In particular, if you think back that the measurements were made in phase 1 and phase 2, which were a few years ago for some, and we're looking at behaviours now. Some behaviours like activity will have changed. We expect, for example, occupational activity to decrease in the older age groups. And so we have to take into account the change in age of the participants, as well as the time interval between the measurements. Phase 1 and phase 2 were conducted over a few years, so the gap between those measurements and those during the COVID-19 study are going to be different for different people. So we have to take into account those factors in our statistical analyses so that we can look more precisely at the changes in behaviour. So what I'm going to show you now are a series of slides that are going to look like this. And this is looking at the change in behaviour between the measurements phase 1 and phase 2, the pre-pandemic, and those taken during the COVID-19 sub-study. And any that fall into the purple box indicate a decrease during the pandemic, and those in the blue box an increase during the pandemic. And those that cross the black line in the middle indicate neither an increase or a decrease. So start with looking at the overall pandemic effect in the whole population that took part, then differences between men and women, between different age groups, and if there are any apparent between the areas of the region. So using the postcode of the participants, we're able to identify people living in more affluent or less affluent areas of the region and make a comparison. So starting with fruit and vegetable consumption, after we had made those adjustments for seasonality and so on, we did see an overall decrease in fruit and vegetable consumption of around 12% in the whole population. When we looked at this by men and women, there was a distinct difference, with women having a much greater decrease in their consumption than men. When we looked at it by age group, this was consistent between the age groups with a decrease in all. And when we looked at it by areas of the region, we did see an indication that those living in the most affluent areas had less of a decrease in their fruit and vegetable consumption than those living in less affluent areas. So moving to expenditure now, energy expenditure and activity, when we looked at overall physical activity, we saw a decrease of around 17%. When we looked at it between men and women, again, we saw that difference, with women having a greater decrease than men. And by age group, it was a consistent decrease across the age groups. When we looked at it by areas, again, we saw that indication that those living in the more affluent areas had less of a decrease in their energy expenditure than those in the less affluent areas of the region. We then looked at it by domain of activity, where activity was taking place. And unsurprisingly, activity expended at work fell substantially across the cohort by around 60%. We then looked at home activity. So these are activities such as housework, gardening, DIY. And overall, we saw no pandemic effect in the whole population. But when we looked at it between men and women, we saw a decrease in home activity in women, but not in men. When we looked at it by age group, we again saw no real change in home activities in the younger age groups, but in those aged 60 and above, we saw a decrease. We didn't see a difference, a trend between the areas of the region, but we did see that those living in middle affluent areas did have a decrease. We looked also at leisure time activities. These are activities like sports, exercise, walking and cycling and so on. And we saw the opposite trend that we see here between men and women, with no change in women's leisure time activity levels, but a decrease of around 13% in men. And we also saw a substantial decrease in the 60-year-plus age group in leisure time activities, as we see here for home activity. So in conclusion, what have we learned so far? Well, as I've shown you today, at a population level, there was a decrease in fruit and vegetable consumption and their overall physical activity, but not everyone was affected equally. We saw distinct differences between men and women and across the age groups, with those in the older age group, 60-year-plus, being affected more. So the response to the pandemic has widened differences in health behaviours in society, particularly in less affluent areas. And as the country emerges from the pandemic, we think public health strategies are urgently needed to address these health inequalities. And we're going to be investigating this further, particularly looking at different dietary components and the effect of changes in body weight between different groups. Thank you very much. So that's the end of my section. I'd now like to hand over to Jane to chair the question and answer session.
Oh, thanks, Kirsten. First of all, I've got a couple of questions for Nick, if that's all right, Nick?
Absolutely, Jane, yeah.
So, first of all, the project work in the Fenland study was initiated because of COVID. And what implications do you think there are more generally for how we engage with participants in research and with patients in healthcare to get perhaps a little bit more participation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jane. I think that many of the things that we did in this study, and indeed the things that we're doing now, like having a session on Zoom with all its challenges, are things that we maybe wouldn't have thought that were possible a couple of years ago. And I think the way we do research will never go back to how it was before. I think the ways of assessing and collecting information from people that we've illustrated here through studying COVID will be applied to many other things as well. But it goes way beyond research into how we deliver healthcare as well. Obviously through necessity during COVID periods, a lot of healthcare has transitioned to being remote. That maybe has not always been a good thing for certain instances, but I think for some forms of healthcare, changes in how we deliver advice and information and make diagnosis at a distance, so-called telehealth, I think they're here to stay, and we really need to be accelerating research into the best ways of doing it. So I think it's here to stay, Jane, and it's going to evolve.
Thank you, Nick. Well, there is a second question to follow up on that, and it's one of the concerns that Kirsten touched upon in her presentation, which is how socioeconomic status has affected the impact of COVID and our response to it. And one of the challenges of using technologies to engage with participants is the risk of excluding people. And what do we know about that challenge from the Fenland study?
yeah, I may hand over a bit to Kirsty to give a few of the details about this, but we're very mindful about this notion of digital exclusion. That, you know, if we make a transition to more digital methods, we do have to worry about who is not able to engage in those methods. And, you know, one of the challenges that we came across in this study was the extent to which people had phones or technology that could enable them to participate. And I think what was really encouraging was that we weren't just recruiting people who had the latest gadget and the latest devices. We were actually able to include people, and that was largely down to our excellent collaboration with colleagues at HUMA, who had older devices and maybe were less well equipped. But we've also undertaken some qualitative work, interviewing people who did participate and also some who did not, to try and really understand these barriers, because I think it's a key question for the future. Are we, by the way we're doing things, are we being sufficiently inclusive of all groups in society? It's a critical question.
Yes, okay, thank you, Nick. Well, I have got some questions that have been moderated by Kirsten from the people who are participating in viewing this webinar. And the first one that's been put up for me is, do you, or you directed to somebody on the panel best qualified to answer this question, think that the periods of physical inactivity forced upon the population by the COVID lockdowns will have a long-term effect on public health? Is that possibly one for you, Kirsten?
I think I'd like Nick to start that one.
Well, I mean, if they were sustained, if those periods of inactivity led to behaviours that were sustained over a prolonged period of time, then they could have a very, disadvantageous impact on public health. I think if they were short-lived and were reversed, maybe the impact would not be so great. But I think the concern is people, have habits, and if people get out of habits, it may be difficult to reverse them. So I think, what's happened over the last 2 years, as Kirsty showed, has had some impacts, and it's had impacts that are different to different people within society. And I don't think it's so straightforward as assuming that, when we finally do get out of the pandemic back to some different new normality, that we will somehow immediately reverse to back to where we were. So I think we do have to be concerned about long-term effects. I think it's a very good question.
And I did notice that in Kirsten's presentation, in particularly for the over 60 age group. Right, the second question that I've got is, does the data go anywhere else other than to the Fenland group? Do you feed up into UK-wide studies?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we are members, and as we've indicated, I think in all our information out to participants, to something called the Longitudinal Linkage Consortium, which is one of the national core studies funded by the government through Patrick Valence's office, the Chief Scientific Officer. And that is an attempt to harness the power of multiple studies like Fenland, together with other studies in the country, to share fully anonymized data in a trusted research environment that can allow people to investigate key questions about the determinants of susceptibility to COVID and its consequences across different cohorts by bringing together the power of multiple studies. Because within Fenland, we had a lot of participants, fortunately relatively few with COVID, and there will be, one hopes, relatively few of those people who then get long COVID. But issues like that, for example, will be best studied by bringing data together across studies. So we are participating in this longitudinal linkage consortium.
Right, thank you, Nick. The third question I have is from people viewing. Were there any differences in heart rate, oxygen levels, etc., in people that had to self-isolate but didn't actually test positive due to someone having had contact with someone who had COVID-19.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that's quite complicated.
I might, at this point, if I may, bring in our colleague Davide.
Yeah, thank you.
From,
yes, of course.
For Humour. And Davide's joined us for the Q&A because Nikola, who spoke earlier, you wouldn't have been able to tell on a webinar, but she is due to have a baby very shortly, and she's had to nip off to her antenatal class. So Davide is stepping in to answer the difficult questions. So Davide, have you got any insight on that question?
So we haven't looked at that particular aggregation of data. I'm not even sure we have that information. Do we have the information about self-isolation, Christy?
We do at a monthly level, but we don't have it in this precise timing. Actually links to another question someone put about the antigen test. We know the exact date the person had the antigen test. And of course, we know the exact date that the antibody test was sent back. But things like self-isolation, we don't know the exact dates of.
Yeah, so we wouldn't be able to define dates in a way that is necessary to look at those. Have you noticed how subtle those changes are in the vital signs? So this particular question, I don't think we will be able to answer. And also, I think maybe this it's worth explaining that for the safety of your own privacy. At Humour, for example, we don't get to see the whole data. We only see the data that has been agreed with Cambridge that we should look into to answer a specific question. So this data point, for example, was not part of self-isolation, was not part of the things that we agreed to see. So we don't see it.
Thank you. Okay, the next question I have is, do you think you stopped the study too soon?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's a question that might benefit from a bit of hindsight. I think at the time I felt we did stop it at the right moment, because the picture of infection and antibody status was about to get very confused by vaccination, and we were also wary of not outstaying our welcome and not getting a dwindling number of people participating in the study. And we had asked a lot of people. We're very aware that the amount of information we were asking people to collect was a lot. So I feel we stopped it at the right moment, when the key questions that we were trying to address were still pertinent. And we stopped it also to focus attention on processing all the data and starting to write up papers. So yeah, I feel it was the right moment. But maybe in the chat, somebody who asked the question, maybe present an alternative view.
Thanks, Nick. Well, the next question I have is, how accurate do you think the antibody tests were? And is there any way to tell?
Well, I think not every accurate in the sense they were able to detect an antibody as measured on the dried blood spot in an equivalent way to a venous sample. And I think the performance of this assay in detecting antibodies was very high. That's been shown in other studies. If by the question somebody's asking, is it possible to have had COVID and not generated an antibody response? Yes. So it's a complicated picture, but we think we did employ an accurate and sensitive and specific test. But as with any test, there are always false negatives and false positives. And part of that is related to the frequency of the condition. So it was an accurate test.
Thank you. The next question I have is, did you measure mental health in this study?
We did, and I'll hand over to Kirsty to answer that one.
We did measure mental health in the app on a monthly basis, and that data is being analysed as we speak and being looked through. It's quite interesting to see there was distinct differences between men and women, but it followed exactly the same trend throughout the study. And that's quite unique in studies to get mental health measurements so regularly over that period, because of course we collected them monthly. And so that's really valuable data set to look at. And we'll be reporting on that very soon, I hope.
Thank you. The next question is, did you have any positive antibody tests without physical changes in heart rate, oxygen saturation and temperature?
So I think what Davide and Nikola were showing from HUMA, and Davide can chip in here to answer, that was looking at those vital sign changes before a diagnosis of COVID based on the antigen test. But we have not attempted to look at it in relation to transition of the antibody test, because the date of that transition, we know when the test was done, but determining, we only have a period in which somebody could have been infected. And that's a slightly different analytical challenge. I know, Davide, whether you want to add anything to that.
Yes, so that's very correct. So we know when someone was tested positive, and we specifically focused on antigen, not antibody. We will do that in the future. But as I said, there is a window of possible infection date. So we are already incorporating some models from literature to estimate the most likely infection day, etc. But that's again on antigen. We might combine antigen and antibody to get a better estimation. One thing that I wanted to mention is that Nikola, for the sake of explaining the data a bit better, showed I would say a very nice example of response of vital signs to infection. It's not always like that. Sometimes there is very little difference. In average, we could see an increase in heart rate, but in average means that for someone were pretty high, for someone was almost non-visible. So the answer is yes to the question, is it possible to see no differences in vital signs because of infection? Yes, the answer is sometimes it happened.
Thank you, Davide. So the next question I have is the inequality in activity due to financial reasons or education or other? Has that been analysed by the team?
It can be analysed and it will be analysed, but what's very interesting is when we've looked at what I was showing was by area, by using people's postcodes of the affluence of the area they lived in, we got very similar results if we used education and so on, and occupation. The trends that I showed, we saw the same, whether or not you took, if you like, individual markers or the region markers. And there is some debate which is the better to use. So I do appreciate that, that's open to interpretation.
Thank you, Kirsten. The next question I have is, do the study results have anything to tell us about long COVID?
I think for the reason I stressed before, that the number of people who diagnosed and symptomatic COVID in this study was relatively small, and therefore, hopefully, the number of people with long COVID will be small. So I think this study by itself will probably not contribute to that regressively, but it added together with other data across the UK, I think it can play a contribution. And certainly the Medical Research Council, along with the National Institute of Health Research, has funded a lot of work across the country into the causes and potential treatments for long COVID, because it is a very important issue. So we will be able to make a small contribution to that, but it's not a major focus of this study.
Right, thank you, Nick. The next question I have is there any data to suggest how the pandemic affected those in manual work as opposed to clerical work?
Well, certainly at national level, if you look at the variation in the frequency of COVID and the severity of initial outcomes in the early phase of the pandemic. That did differ quite markedly between groups defined by various socioeconomic characteristics and indeed by ethnicity. And the challenge has been to try and unpick what the reasons for that are. Is it to do with the fact, for example, that maybe certain people in particular occupations had to keep working during the early phase of the pandemic and weren't able to work from home or in the same way as everybody else? You know, there is a big discussion about the extent to which the disparities in COVID outcomes are linked to ethnicity itself, or ethnicity combined with social inequalities and differences between people. And I think that is an agenda that needs much greater investigation over time, and is a very important thing for us to think about as a country, because, you know, COVID has really put a spotlight back on social inequalities and social disparities in health. And it is quite telling that in the aftermath of the epidemic, as we move from the epidemic phase at least to the endemic phase, that, you know, we are putting a much greater emphasis in public health in this country on thinking about inequalities and really trying to think about solutions to redress them, because it is a continual shame in this country that those inequalities persist.
Thank you, Nick. Well, I think it's coming up to the time that I ask my last question of this webinar, and I think it's one for you, Nick, and I think it's one that echoes many questions that have come in from people viewing. We've talked today about the Fenland COVID study and how that built on data that was collected from the previous two studies that had clinical visits. As I understand it, the team was preparing plans for a third clinic visit when the pandemic started. So what are your current plans for a third research visit now?
Sure. Well, I think we were indeed funded by the Medical Research Council to start a third phase of the Fenland study, which we had scheduled, you know, in 2020. Obviously, we're unable to do that because of the pandemic. I think it's fair to say the success of what we have achieved together with the help of all the participants here and the fantastic engagement of people in the collection of data of all different types remotely has really changed our view about what that future study should look like. So we are planning the next phase of the Fenland study to include some of the elements that we've done before, repeated, but to try and build on this foundation of collection of data remotely from people, to try and really study much more actively in the real world how people are engaging with what they're eating, with what they're doing, and how that's impacting on their metabolic state. And we think there are some very exciting new technologies that we could adapt and use and collect data remotely from people in the next phase of the study. So, you know, the efforts that people have engaged with us during this Fenland COVID study have been important in their own right. But I think they are going to be particularly important in showing us what is possible for the future. And we're definitely keen to build on that as we enter the next phase of the study. So I hope that we can build on people's enthusiasm to participate. It's really fantastic that 4,000 people helped us with this study. It's brilliant that there are, you know, well in excess of 200 people who've been here this evening to ask questions. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to answer them all. We will endeavour to circulate some information to try and address any unanswered questions. But possibly at this point, I'd like to just draw this to a close, repeat our thanks to everybody for working very hard during this challenging time to engage in this study. It has been particularly useful. like to thank you, Jane, as chair of the Fenland participant panel, and your colleagues, because I think your role has been very important. And like to thank everybody who's worked with us in the MRC epidemiology unit to put all this work together. It's been a lot of work, and but it's been very useful and valuable work. So with that, we'll draw this session to a close, and thank you all very much for your attendance.